Hi there. Thanks for tuning into this episode of R&R's Ask the Expert. I'm your host, Valerie King, R&R's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined today by Michael Pinto, CEO of Wondermakers Environmental. He's earned 6 professional designations, including but not limited to Certified Safety Professional and Certified Mold Professional. He is the author of over 230 published articles and several books, including Fungal Contamination, a comprehensive guide for remediation. He's also volunteered extensive time and expertise for the development of the RIA Forensic Restoration Guidelines, the IICRC S520 standard for mold remediation, and the RIA IICRC AIHA white papers, which explain proper procedures for addressing SARS-CoV-2 through cleaning and application of disinfectants. Now, mold remediation being one of Michael's areas of expertise, we invited him on to talk about the market for helping mold sensitized individuals. And it's actually the focus of a recent article he authored for R&R, which is titled, "How Can You Tell If Your Mold Remediation is Good Enough for Sensitized Occupants?" So I'm looking so forward to diving deeper into that area and gleaning more insights for you listeners to put to work as restorers and remediators. So thanks so much for joining me, Michael.
No problem. It's so fun to be able to do this. I'm so used to just writing articles for you. To be able to actually chat, this is going to be great fun.
I feel the same way. It'll be exciting to put words to wait. I should say voice to your written word. All right. So for
Absolutely.
those who are not familiar, I'm sure that's few and far between, but for those who aren't familiar, could you share a bit about Wondermakers Environmental and yourself, your background and expertise, of course, a little bit about your mold remediation experience?
Well, certainly. Well, thank you for that. And let me just use a couple of props here, if you don't mind. We started Wondermakers, that would be my wife and I, 33 years ago, because when the asbestos regulations were first coming out, people were using tools like this, a jackknife, to take asbestos insulation samples. And essentially, I invented a different system, core and a cutter sleeve that's in a vial to safely take asbestos samples, and thought that we were just going to be a manufacturer of that particular product. We've been selling that for 33 years. It is absolutely the premier way to take a asbestos sample safely. And what happened is that people started asking the question, well, if you figured out how to take the sample safely, they had questions about how do you do the inspections. We had to know all the rules and regulations, so they started asking us questions about asbestos regulations. So then we started, filling in that and also doing some of the inspections ourselves. And then lead-based paint regulations came shortly after that, and we had some expertise in that area, so we started sharing that. And then one thing led to another, and people just started asking us about indoor air quality issues. And over those 33 years, we've dealt with everything from, like I said, asbestos and lead, indoor air quality, chemicals, certainly mold for 22 years now, focused on some of that. But some of the exotics too. I mean, we've helped clients with anthrax, with Ebola, swine flu before COVID. You chatted about, helping people write the guidelines for that. Forensic cleanup, which is, blood and trauma mostly. So all those issues, radiation, EMF, electromagnetic fields, basically anything having to do with the indoor environment, we've gained some expertise and have helped people deal with those contaminants.
Certainly runs the gamut and gives us a sense of the reality that your umbrella reaches far beyond mold. But I'm excited to dive into that topic today. So, more on that. Let's just start with the basics. Ground zero. What is mold remediation?
So I think different people have different ideas of what it is. I'm very um, clear to me, mold remediation is the removal of the contaminant, whether it's the actual source material or the secondary byproducts, the spores and the other fragments and things like that. So it's not just covering it, it's not just trying to kill it in place or anything like that. It's the actual removal. To me, that's what mold remediation is, and I think that fits with the guidelines from both the government regulatory agencies and the industry associations.
Thanks for that. Okay, second key part of what we're going to talk about today. What does it mean to be a mold sensitized individual? Can you elaborate on, things like symptoms and your article talks a little bit about how the understanding of that has evolved. So, yeah, your take on mold sensitized individuals.
So let's just start with the basics here. Every person is, genetically unique. But what has been discovered, starting 20 some years ago, they were just starting to get an idea of this, but certainly over the last 5 to 8 years, there's been a huge increase in the understanding of what's going on here. And that is that certain people, their genetic makeup makes them sensitive, if you will, to exposure to mold. And for a lot of those people, they're going to go through their life. They're never going to have a heavy mold exposure. It's not going to trigger anything. And so they're just going to live their life and they're never going to know that they're mold sensitized. Other people, at some point in their life, are going to be exposed to mold, and it's going to be high enough that their body doesn't clear the mold out of their system like the majority of people do. And there's debate as to whether the genetics impact 5 to 10% of the population. But even if it's 5% and you've got 330 million people, that's 15 million people, 15 or 16 million people that, potentially are going to be sensitized to mold if they have exposure to it. So it's not like it's a small pool of people. And what happens to these people where their body can't deal with the mold the same way as most people is that when they get exposed to mold, then they have much more dramatic symptoms. It's not just runny eyes or sneezing or coughing or anything like that. It literally is a multi-system. It impacts their whole body, and intense fatigue, neurological issues. I've got in my classes, I've got a whole page of step-by-step symptoms that are in there. And a lot of times they don't seem to line up with mold. Like I said, they're the muscle aches, the cognitive dissonance, the inability to, or the ability to impact their vision. Their vision actually gets worse because of the exposure to the mold, because the mold has poisons that get in the body, and the people that are truly sensitized, their bodies can't flush the poisons out, and so they build up in their body, and they're basically being poisoned by the mold.
Wow. So, as we continue to kind of set the stage for our conversation, mycotoxins, another term that comes up in the article we're kind of referring back to. What are those? What are mycotoxins? And can you kind of explain how they fit into this conversation of mold sensitized individuals?
Sure. So initially, and I'm talking about 1998, 99, 2000, so we're talking 21, 22, 23 years ago. The thought process was it was the spores or the fragments of the mold organism that was causing these reactions to people. And later, as they dug into it, what they found out is that some of the spores and some of the mold organisms themselves actually produce poisons generally to ward off other competing organisms. If there's bacteria on the surface and the mold wants to grow, it has to displace that bacteria. Or if there's one mold species growing and another mold species that grows slower wants to take that over, it somehow has to displace that other set of mold that's growing there. So the way that it does that is to produce poisons, which then kill the other mold or kill the bacteria, and then that mold can take over that environment. So that's all well and good if you're mold against bacteria or mold against mold, but if people get in the way of that and they actually have exposure to that mold that's producing these poisons, that's what mycotoxin stands for. That's mold-produced poisons. So bacteria produces endotoxins and exotoxins and things like that. But if it's a poison that actually is created by a fungal organism, then that's called mycotoxins. And so what we're learning now is it's not just the spores, it's not just the fragments, it's a whole range of things. It's the mycotoxins that could be produced. There's other small fragments that are on the outside shell of the spore called beta glucans that now people are looking at and developing ways to sample for that and test that. And so what we just have to understand is that it's kind of a big world out there, and we've got all these different components to the mold, and our goal, particularly when we're dealing with sensitized individuals, should be to clean it all, right? We want to get rid of it all and we want to clean it all. And if we have ways of testing for different parts and pieces of it, okay, we can test for the spores, okay, let's make sure that those are gone. We can test for the fragments, let's make sure those are gone. But if we can test for the mycotoxins and we can test later on for the beta glucans and things like that, then yeah, let's just make sure everything's gone, because we're not sure exactly what combination of things triggers the symptoms in the sensitized individuals.
Very helpful. So, on to the intersection of mold remediation as a service and mold sensitized occupants as prospects and customers. Can you talk a little bit about what that market looks like? Your sense of the demand for mold remediation among sensitized occupants to mold, and then the supply. Are there enough services to meet the need right now?
So let me approach it just a little bit differently, which is backwards there. Is there enough supply? Um, the fact of the matter is, any company that's been doing mold work for more than a few months has probably done mold work for a sensitized individual. They may or may not have known it, but they've probably done that work. And until we understood this a little bit better, and still where a lot of companies struggle right now that are providing mold remediation services, is they just call them difficult customers, or the mold crazies, or the nutcases, or some of these pejorative terms, because they don't understand that the mold sensitized individual needs a higher level of service than what they typically provide for mold remediation. So just as a quick example of that, most of the standard mold remediation service companies are interested in finding the wet areas and finding where the mold is growing and removing that and moving on. We build a containment, we put it under negative pressure. There's lots of companies that do that well. So they take care of all of that, but what gets missed is all of the secondary contamination. Are the contents impacted by the spores and the mycotoxins and the beta glucans we talked about? Is the rest of the house been impacted because it's been moving through the HVAC system? And so the typical company that comes in, sees the mold on the basement wall, isolates that, removes the drywall, cleans it all up, cleans the brick behind it, takes some tests and says they're done, that's going to work for 90% of the population, right? Because it's 5 to 10% that are potentially, susceptible to being mold sensitized. But that process, if it stops there, isn't going to work for the mold sensitized. They have to, the contractor then has to understand there may be contents that need to be cleaned, there may be HVAC system that needs to be cleaned, and there may actually be a whole house that needs to be cleaned as part of that mold removal process to deal with a sensitized individual. So really the difference when you're dealing with a sensitized individual as compared to a standard mold project is the scope of the project. The standard scope is just remove the physical stuff and clean it, test it, and be done. Sensitized individuals, you have to look at all three of those other parts. You got to look at the physical removal, the content cleaning, HVAC cleaning, and even the whole house cleaning. So are there, and then let me just finish, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but are there enough people that are doing that? And the answer is no, not intentionally. There's people who have kind of, wormed their way into it and figured it out by trial and error. But what we really need, in my opinion, is more companies to step up and understand that this is a substantial but small subsection of the market, and then decide that they want to serve that subsection of the market. And then to do that, I'm an educator, so I would suggest that they get some training and everything. But even just understanding that they're trying to serve that subset of the market would be a great first step, because it tells them that they have a wider scope, which quite honestly is why some of these companies are moving in this direction, because they're bigger projects. I mean, it's one thing to go in and do a $3,000 mold removal project, like I said, down the basement and take out 100 square feet of drywall. It's a whole different project to do $20,000 worth of cleaning in a house.
Yeah. Yeah. So through that lens of like intentionally providing a service that is well informed and truly impactful in the ways it needs to be to a sensitized occupant, someone who's sensitized to mold, are you finding that the contractors or the service providers offering that right now are like your mold remediator who solely focuses on mold, your restoration contractor who does that in many other things, a different kind of contractor? I guess I'm just curious the profile, if you will, of who's offering services to these individuals today.
Okay, so let me clarify that by saying the ones who are offering it well are the ones who are interested in doing it well and are actually focused on this. And like I said, have either figured it out accidentally or have read some of the articles that we've been pushing around in the magazines and things like that and just been curious about it. But it's all over the place. I mean, I've got Pure Clean franchises, I've got Stanley Steamer franchises, I've got Independence, I've got Atlantic Restoration out of Atlanta was probably one of the first to really focus on this aspect of the industry almost 20 years ago. Clean out of South Carolina, Laura Young at Bartwood Construction out in California, focusing on the content cleaning portion of it, where her company will actually provide a secondary service to other mold remediation companies. They go and do the physical removal, but if there's a lot of contents that need to be cleaned, her company will specialize in coming and dealing with those contents. So to me, it's not a profile like, well, it's the franchises or it's only the independents or it's this or that. It's truly the people who understand that this is a separate market and they either want to specialize in that and that's all they're going to do. We've got several companies that we work with that's all they do, or it's just part of a whole range of restoration services. They do everything from, floods and fire and hurricanes all the way to mold remediation and then that specialized niche of mold remediation for sensitized people.
Thank you, Michael. Now I'm excited to dive into, that what this all means for restorers and remediators, what they should know as they go to work in settings like this, where they're serving a customer who is mold sensitive. So to set the record straight, I know you addressed this earlier, but should they plan to apply the same mold remediation techniques to a customer who does not have a sensitivity to mold as they do to a customer who is mold sensitized?
The quick answer is yes. I mean, the basic techniques, the basic piece of equipment, what you're going to do is universal, regardless if it's a sensitized occupant or not. The difference is the degree to which you apply that. So, like I said before, if it's kind of a standard and the people aren't talking about a lot of weird symptoms or anything like that, you go in, you do the source removal and you contain it and you clean that containment and you pass your post-remediation clearances. I mean, as I said, 80 or 90% of the population, that's going to be good to go. And why not? For the mold sensitized occupant, though, you're going to have to go beyond that. It's not that the techniques change, it's the scope of work expands. So just like we talked about before, it's not just the source removal anymore. It's going to be HVAC cleaning, it's going to be content cleaning, it's going to be whole house cleaning or building cleaning, if it's commercial structure, things like that.
All righty. So back to education, which you alluded to. What kind of training and education should they engage in before they serve a mold sensitized occupant?
So again, this is going to sound a little biased because I'm an instructor and we teach a sensitized course. We would love to see people in that, remediation for sensitized occupants course. I think that, really helps to hone in on this. But in a broader picture, anybody who wants to serve this audience really just needs to get beyond the basics. So if all they've ever had is a worker's course, then certainly they need to step up to a supervisor's course, whether it's IICRC or NORME or RIA or, all sorts, IIQA, all sorts of different providers that are out there. But just some upper level course so that you have a little bit understanding of the why as well as the what. And then if you really want to make this a business, and depending on your social media expertise is where I would say the companies that deal with sensitized occupants tend to be more savvy with social media. And the reason for that is that the sensitized occupants have a very aggressive social media platform. There's all sorts of different groups that they're involved in. And so the contractor that wants to serve them pretty quickly figures out that they get into some of these groups either by invitation or by people making referrals to them because they did a good job for one sensitized occupant, and they're on a group where somebody says, well, who should do my work? And they say, well, we tried XYZ company and they were horrible, or we tried ABC company and they really understood what we needed and they were wonderful to work with. And that word of mouth through social media really fuels a lot of the business. It drives a lot of business for the sensitized individuals. And we get it all the time. I mean, just because of the articles we've written and things like that, we appreciate very much R&R publishing some of those. But because of those articles, people will search us out and they'll find us and then they'll ask us, we might be able to help them on a consulting side. Sometimes they just ask us, who would we recommend in their geographic area, to help with the remediation. So that social media and word of mouth is really what drives a lot of the industry for mold sensitized remediation.
Helpful. So social media is a marketing generator or is a lead generator really in building those connections and awareness among that community that needs this kind of a service.
And then the other thing that is really important if somebody really wants to take their business to the next level for mold remediation for the mold sensitized is that they're going to have to understand that the doctors are driving a lot of this. And that's good and that's bad. I mean, some of the doctors have their own sense of what needs to be done from a remediation standpoint. And a lot of what they recommend, I agree with. And some of the stuff that they recommend, they're trying to force the remediators to be the doctors. And I think everybody needs to understand their role. That's one of the reasons in our class when we talk about sensitized individual, and I hope I'm not jumping ahead here, but we talk about gathering a team of individuals. And one of the difficulties and one of the reasons we hear that restoration contractors don't want to work with mold sensitized individuals is because they had a client at one point in time that turned out was mold sensitized, and they started dealing with them, and if they're a competent contractor, they start answering their questions and they start fixing their house and that sort of stuff. And the client, the mold sensitized client, if they don't have a team of other professionals that they can refer them to, I call it the savior complex, where the mold sensitized person starts looking at the remediation contractor and saying, well, what should I do in regards to my medical, or how should we do the testing afterwards, or how should we do the investigation to find out if there's anything else left in the house or if the contents are contaminated. Well, some contractors can handle that, other contractors can't. How do we pay for it is an interesting question. If we find out as the restoration contractor that you've got contents and HVAC and whole house cleaning as well as some mold remediation, and that's the other thing too I should point out, I'm just going to interrupt myself, is that many of the people that are dealing with sensitized individuals are not the first contractor in. A mold remediation contractor has already done the source removal, done it well, done it bad, lots of different scenarios there, but the scope wasn't wide enough. And so the person's symptoms didn't get better. And so now they're off to the second or third contractor. They're desperately trying to find somebody who can clean their house. And that's fine. You clean their house, but if they also don't have the right medical to match with that, we're dealing with the environmental over here, but they also have to be dealing with the medical. If those two aren't lining up and going together, their symptoms are not going to improve. I can clean the house to the point where it's as clean as a clean room, right, in a pharmaceutical factory. But if the poisons are already in their body and their body's not, being taught through, different medical techniques how to release those poisons, they're never going to feel any better because the poisons are already built up in their body. So the medical and the environmental have to march side by side. And that's where the contractors need to develop a base of other professionals to help them, so that when somebody says, well, my symptoms aren't any better, and they know the house is clean, then they can point them back toward the medical side, or they can point them to a financial person. I mean, we've got one contractor that very successful because they got a banker involved, and they said, if we told you that there's these people that need this work, and it's how they're going to get better, could you develop a class of home loan, like home improvement loan, where they wouldn't have to, explain every time why they're doing this? That they literally would have a category of home improvement loan for mold sensitized individuals. And you can do that, when you're a local contractor and you're putting your business through a particular bank and everything. Those are the sorts of creative connections that people need to do. Find medical providers in the area that you can direct them to, find counselors. I mean, there's a lot of psychological issues. These people have been damaged, with a long-term illness. So having counselors to help them, having bankers, having industrial hygienists and inspectors, and just having a team of people that you trust to send a client to makes a huge difference. And that whole idea and you hit the nail on the head, if you develop the right network of professionals to help you with the mold sensitized, then the cross referrals start coming. So the inspectors will send the contractor people who need the work, the contractor will send the inspectors people who need, a more detailed inspection. The doctors will start sending you some of their clients that don't have the right remediation people helping them. It really is a very cool thing to see develop.
Yes, yes. Thank you for sharing those creative ideas. Now, curious about this whole assessing and this documenting aspect. You talked a little bit about sampling and things like that earlier, but you dove into this a bit in the article. So, what about that? Like the effectiveness of a remediation job for mold sensitized occupants, really making sure that you're holding yourself accountable and making sure it was effective. Um, Mycotoxin sampling, notably. What can you share with us about that?
So again, this goes back to standard remediation versus sensitized individuals. So standard remediation, the various documents, particularly the IICRC standard, you're basically returning the structure to a pre-loss condition, or the term that they use is a normal fungal ecology, a condition 1 normal fungal ecology. The problem with that for a mold sensitized person is that's not good enough. Normal isn't good enough because they've already got like the toxins in their body and they're already sick and everything. So getting them back to normal or getting their environment back to normal isn't good enough for them. You need to have that clean. And so that's a different level of, or a different criteria for your post-remediation samples, quite honestly. I don't want it normal. I want it better than normal because these people aren't normal, so to speak. They're sensitized, so we have to do better than normal. And again, we've got that recommended criteria for post-remediation. You don't even have to come to class if anybody needs that. They can just go to our Wondermakers website. we are very generous trying to share that because it's helping people. It's not about, whether somebody needs to pay us a fee for using that criteria or anything. That's crazy. What we're trying to do is educate people so that if you're going to deal with a mold remediation project and or suspect that one of your clients or one of the members of the household is sensitized because they talk about a lot of symptoms and stuff like that, then our recommendation would be hold yourself to a higher standard, get it really clean rather than just back to a normal fungal ecology. And again, this is a little different for restoration contractors because everybody's so used to not, aggravating the insurance company. Well, we don't want to do better. We don't want them to, after the fire, we don't want their house to be better than pre-loss condition. We just want to return it to what it was before. But when you're dealing with mold sensitized people, you have to think a step above because they've already been injured by what's going on in the house potentially or the building. And so you need to make it good enough for them so that they can heal. We talk about it in our class about building a refuge for them. So if you know it's really clean and they're not getting any additional exposure, then they're in a spot where they can work with their doctors and their counselors and stuff so that they can start healing. But until they can't heal if they're still being exposed to the poison. The doctors can't move it out of their system if every time we move some of that poison out, they're just breathing more poison in. So.
Okay. Thanks for sharing. Those resources are available for free. And also speaking to that dynamic that restorers face when it comes to providing a service like this, where it kind of needs to go above and beyond what they're used to just from a contractual claims getting paid perspective. So, okay. Now, before we go, I'd love to talk about this from just a takeaways perspective. So, two general questions about remediation. First, any key trends or any key themes that mold remediation contractors should be aware of heading into a new year?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, there's a couple of things that is interesting to me. And as I thought about this ahead of time, the first thing is that just because something's out there doesn't mean that everybody knows about it. And so that's why we continue to write these articles, and that's why we continue to try and share them through the various industry, journals and things. So it's surprising to me how much of the mold remediation industry isn't doing air scrubbing with tubes or with tails on the negative air machines at the end of their project. They're creating these containments, they're creating negative pressure, which is what the majority of the industry standards call for. But as you get toward the end of that, and particularly for mold sensitized individuals, but I think for all projects, you should think about mitigating or minimizing. You still want to maintain some negative pressure so that if there's any contamination, it doesn't leak out and affect the rest of the building. But you want to do a lot of air scrubbing in there. And the most effective way to do that is to put a diffuser tail on your negative air machine and let the air recirculate in there. And really do that in such a way that the air is circulating around the entire containment rather than just having the air exhaust out the bottom of the machine and run along the floor and then bounce on the wall and come back and go back to the machine. Because what happens in a situation like that is that you'll often get the mold spores and some of these smaller fragments that are very light, they'll stratify so that literally from chest up to the ceiling, it's pretty contaminated, but from chest down, it's really clean because the air is, you're not forcing the air to diffuse enough. And so there's a pattern where the lower air is clean and the upper air isn't. And so, someone comes in to take their samples and typically, they put them on a stand and they try and get them, the official term is breathing zone height, which is kind of in your chest and throat area. And that might not be high enough to actually understand that you've got contamination going on in the upper part of the containment as compared to the lower part. So that's one of the trends that I would like to see, expand in 2022 is people just really starting to understand that air scrubbing is good and air scrubbing where we're actually diffusing it through the whole room is actually better. So we're actually, yeah, we're actually have some videos, some short videos. As much of an electronic dinosaur as I am, I do have staff here that is pushing me into the 20th century, and eventually we'll get to the 21st century. Um, we're only 20 years behind. But anyway, we've got some videos that are there that short 2, 3, 4 minute videos that show people how to do some of these diffuser tubes and stuff. And again, I would just argue, or not argue, but recommend that all they have to do is go to the Wondermakers website, www.wondermakers.com. That'll get you there, and go to the education section and you'll see a lot of the articles, but you also start to see some of the videos and things that we're putting out. And it's there's no subscription. It's all free. It's what we do. We educate the industry. We love to get people in class. Obviously, those are paid classes and stuff. But it's all about sharing the information because there's just so much that's out there that people should know, and we're just trying to share some of that.
Thank you. Speaking of sharing, speaking of educating in classes, I am sure you get all kinds of questions. I mean, in all of the topics that you cover, but when it comes to mold remediation, is there a most common question you get asked within your classes or just in general when you're at a show? What is that most common question? And if you wouldn't mind, the answer.
Well, I would go so far as to say the most common question typically comes to us through email or telephone, or like you said, at a show or something like that. But it's client driven. And the question is this, or a variation of this. My inspector, my contractor, my whatever says that they're just going to spray something, fog something, kill something, paint something. Is that the right thing to do? And the answer is no. that is that's a dodge. They're not doing mold remediation at that point. We talked at the very beginning of this session that it's removal and it's cleaning. And there's unfortunately too many what I call spray and pray people in the industry. We've got this chemical, it's a really powerful chemical, and I don't care, is it coming out of a jug or a bottle or a machine? Is it a hydroxyl radical generator? Is it an ozone generator? Is it a foam? Is it a spray? Is it a fog? Is it ionized bit technology on the end of it? All of those can be useful, but they're adjuncts to the remediation. They're not a substitute for the remediation. So the most common question we get at the level that we're at is, like I said, they say they want to do this. Does this make sense to you? And most of the time when they start that question with one of those scenarios, the answer is no, that doesn't make sense. And here's why: you're not removing the source, you know, and part of the issue there is that, yeah, these are very powerful chemicals, whether they're gas or foams or sprays or whatever. And yeah, they can kill the mold, but dead mold still can have the beta glucans, it still can have the mycotoxins in there. They're not necessarily just vaporizing all that. And so, and even if you're covering it, we've had situations where people paint it over with antimicrobial encapsulants. But depending on how much water is under, so they put a layer on top of it. But if there's nutrients and water on the underneath side, yeah, it stops growing here, but it grows farther into the substrate, grows into the block wall, grows into the inside of the drywall, the wood, whatever. And you're still going to have problems later on because some of that mold is eventually going to work its way out through the building system. Anywhere the air can go, the spores can go.
Wow, that is very insightful. Thank you for that answer and that question that you get so often. All right, before we go, I don't want to leave without asking you about the unignorable reality we're still living in, which is the pandemic. So, it's what, nearly 2 years later now, since the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, the onset of it, so to speak. So I'm curious, based on your very meaningful involvement in, the cleaning and the disinfection procedures and all of that, is there anything of note that comes to mind when you think about the fact that it's 2 years later, whether it's, projections looking into the future, takeaways from, 2020 and 2021? What can you share with us there?
So the first thing I share, I think I speak for the entire population here when I say it's so sad that a lot of this has been politicized. I mean, it's hard to really tell where the science was. Um, and that's why I'm so proud of the work that we did. If you think about it, if people really realize the IRA and the IICRC, who are, you know, our industry colleagues, but at different points in time have, been at odds with one another. And even the American Industrial Hygiene Association, all three of those organizations got together and put that task force together where we developed the right, and I say that, with some humility, the right way to, disinfect different facilities to help with the COVID situation. Now, what we've learned over the past few years is that the cleaning and the disinfection is helpful, probably not as helpful as proper air movement and introduction of additional outside air. So that's important. But what I would say is that you also have to understand that anything related to COVID right now, you've got somebody who's sick who wants to come back to work, you've got somebody who tested positive, et cetera. You do have to understand that there's the technological response and there's the psychological response. And I don't want to say that a lot of the things that restoration contractors are doing with their sanitization and cleaning techniques are all just psychological, but there's a certain amount of that. If you're going to have people that are going to come back to a workspace where somebody has tested positive for COVID or been sick for, very sick or got into the hospital or something like that, and there's people that are fighting over, mask mandates and vaccinations and things like that. Yeah, sometimes businesses need to do things to show their team that they're really serious about this. And so, along with a policy for how to deal with COVID with the employees, doing extra cleaning and doing extra sanitization is not a bad thing. It's certainly not going to hurt anything. And there is some evidence that it does help. So, and then psychologically, there's evidence that it does a lot to help endear the team to the company. At least they care.
Thanks for that take, that multi-pronged approach. I think that's important what you brought up, that it's multifaceted, dealing with something so multifaceted. So I
And
appreciate that.
politicized, unfortunately, we just can't ignore how politicized the whole COVID, pandemic has become. And, as I said, I think when people understand that there's no single right answer, and it's, as you said, it's multifaceted. So I would not ever tell people stop washing your hands. I would never tell people stop cleaning the surfaces. But what I would say is wash your hands, clean the surfaces, add extra outside air or filtration if you can. If that's not possible, add air filtration devices in the workplace or in the home. And some of the technologies that are out there, like I said before, is a little bit negative toward the hydroxyl radicals for, for mold remediation as a replacement for mold remediation. But man, they're a heck of a device to bring in now to help deal with COVID. I mean, you can actually kill some of those viruses by using the hydroxyl radicals without putting people in the building at risk. So why not use some of that technology?
Very, very interesting. This has been a great deep dive, and it's nice to get your take on COVID as it stands at this point, and also just your takeaways, high level, on mold remediation. I could spend several more hours with you just on this, I'm sure, not to mention all of the other verticals that you are an expert in. So
Well, thank you.
thanks for complimenting your very, very well-written and insightful article with this conversation. I think it's a nice complement.
Well, it turned out, as I said at the beginning, this has been so much fun to just chat with you and go in a couple of different directions instead of, um, because when we write the articles, we try and be focused so that the reader understands what they're going to get and get there pretty smartly. But yeah, this is fun when you can go in a lot of different directions. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. This has been just very enjoyable.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. We'll have to come together again for another topic and another conversation in the near future. I'll look forward to that.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, so before we go, where can listeners go to learn more about you and more about Wonder Makers Environmental?
Well, two things I would do if this is the chance I get to do a little plug. Um, First of all, certainly send them to our website, wondermakers.com, www.wondermakers.com. That's just a great place to learn a little bit more about us, products and education and articles, and like I said, even some of the videos we have up there. The other thing I would like to mention is that we are working with NORMI, the National Organization of Mold Remediators and Inspectors, to offer the sensitized individual remediators class, or the remediation for sensitized individuals class. The next one will be live in Florida if they want to attend in person, January 18 and 19. But because we're cooperating with NORMI, you can also join online. So a couple of different areas there. So just go to the NORMI website, that's NORMI.org, and that will get you in touch under the education or the training section there on the website. You can learn about the sensitized individual class.
Thanks so much, Michael. Great information, useful resources. I'm looking forward to sharing this with the world. And other than that, thank you, listeners and viewers, for more insights on restoration, remediation, and the people behind it all. Of course, you can visit our website, randrmagonline.com, also Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. And if you haven't yet, please be sure to follow our podcast so that you can keep up with all of our latest episodes and give us a quick review and rating. And we're also on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, so we invite you to follow us on there too. This has been R&R's Ask the Expert. Thanks for listening.